Hello, my name is Ghinwa Hakim, and you are watching The Arabic Hour. Today, we bring you a Skype interview with Dr. Rosemary Sayigh, author of Yusif Sayigh, Arab Economist and Palestinian Patriot, A Fractured Life Story.
For me, one of the importances of Yusif's life is that he represents, I think, a large class of Palestinians who struggle without, a really worthy leadership. And there are many others like him. I mean, maybe certain characteristics I admire, for instance, are unique. I think that we can gain hope from reading his life that there will always be Palestinians like him, however bad the political situation is and however abject the leadership seems to be at the current moment.
Dr. Rosemary Sayigh received a PhD in Social Anthropology from the University of Hull, UK, in 1994, an MA in Sociology and Anthropology from the American University of Beirut in 1976, and a BA in English Language and Literature from Oxford University in 1948. From 2000 until the present, she has been a visiting lecturer at CAMES, Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies. Her publications include Palestinians, From Peasants to Revolutionaries, 1979, selected by Choice as one of their outstanding academic books for 1979. Too Many Enemies, The Palestinian Experience in Lebanon, 1994. Voices, Palestinian Women Narrate Displacement, 2008. She has also authored numerous journal articles and book chapters and has taken part in a large number of panels and conferences. She continues to actively engage in community activities in the Palestinian camps in Lebanon. Today's interview revolves around her most recent book entitled Yusif Sayigh, Arab Economist and Palestinian Patriot, A Fractured Life Story. The Skype interview was conducted by the Arabic Hour's Dr. Elaine Hagopian.
Thank you, Ghinwa, and we're happy today to have with us Rosemary Sayigh, all the way from Beirut. We want to discuss today, Rosemary, this book that you put together on your husband. It's his memoir, and it's called Yusif Sayigh, Arab Economist, Palestinian Patriot. This memoir, edited by Rosemary Sayigh from taped interviews with her husband, is really a gift to the younger Palestinian generations and to Palestinian history. Yusif Sayigh was a very humble and honorable man, and he is certainly worthy of this memoir published posthumously by his wife. I recommend it to everyone as an example for the new generations. Sayigh's efforts on behalf of his people were complicated by the fact that he was acting while events in Palestine were irreversibly in process. Nonetheless, he was very active, and he acted in a very principled way. And I think that new generations will find his mode of activism and his principled stands an important role model for the future. Nonetheless, in spite of the fact that events were overcoming the Palestinians, he continued to employ his talent as an economist to plan the underpinnings of a Palestinian resistance and a hoped-for eventual state. During the interview which follows, a number of organizations and individuals are mentioned that need to be identified. For example, Yusif Sayigh was a member of the Parti Populaire Syrian, or known in English as the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. This party, which was founded by Antoun Saad in 1932, was a secular, non-sectarian party, and it sought to reunite Greater Syria, or what is known as the Fertile Crescent, which included Palestine. It attracted at the time a large number of well-known Palestinian intellectuals as well as other Arabs, because it was, in fact, secular and because it did accent the issue of Palestine. Yusif Sayigh joined this party in 1936 and he stayed with it until the early 1950s. Nonetheless, he also was very much interested in the work of the Arab Higher Committee, which originally was founded in 1936 to unite all the parties within Palestine in an effort to try to reverse the growing Zionist presence. In 1937, nonetheless, the British mandate outlawed it. Eventually, it was reconstituted in 1947 under the leadership of the Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini, but the organization was not able to withstand the onslaught of the 1948 war. I think it's important to pause a moment and ask, who was the Mufti? He was admired by his people, and yes, as is often said by Zionists, he met with Hitler in November 1941. The Mufti sought German help to prevent the takeover of Palestine by the Zionists, and to also prevent the immigration of Jews into Palestine that was agreed to in 1933 by the Zionist and Nazi agreement called the Transfer Agreement, which involved some financial aspects and actually brought more German Jews to Palestine in the Zionist effort to populate Palestine more with Jews and to try to create a majority there, which they didn't do until well after the 48 war. In 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization was formed. Sayigh became a member of the National Council and was part of the executive committee initially. He worked with the PLO in economic planning and all the way up until and before Oslo. He worked to help develop a plan for a future Palestinian state. He did not agree with Oslo, and he was very critical of Yasser Arafat's leadership. I think this book is rich, and it ought to be read by anyone interested in Palestinian history and injustice for Palestine and Palestinians. We thank you for this book. I read it with immense interest. It is a very rich book. It is history. It is important from every point of view. I wonder if you will just share with us how you put together this book, because I knew Yusif, and he was not the type to sit down and write his memoir. So I'm just want you to tell our audience how this book was put together.
Well, Elaine, I'm an oral historian, and I'd recorded other people's stories, and Yusif was a fantastic storyteller. It was one of his great gifts to hold an audience with his stories. And I persecuted him for years to let me record his life story. And he was always traveling, and he refused. And then finally, in 1989, I think, he had to have an operation which kept him at home for something like 3 weeks in bed. So this was my opportunity. And I more or less forced him to record with me. And at first, you know, he didn't want to, but then actually once we started, he liked it. He got quite enthusiastic about it. And we used to, in the evening, plan, you know, each day what we would talk about the next day. That's how we planned the structure. And what we would cover. And then, of course, it took years to transcribe it and to edit it and then to find a publisher. So the whole process has taken a very long time, but I feel very happy that it actually finally got published by the American University in Cairo Press.
And it's distributed by Oxford in the United States. So,
Oh, really?
Yes, so I'm really pleased about that. I think it was amazing when I was reading the book. There were so many questions I would have liked to ask Yusif. I could almost see his face. He had a wonderful sense of humor, and he was a gentleman. He was such a distinguished gentleman, but he was so open to people. Did you feel that after you put this together from the tapes that you did get, that there were many questions that you wanted yet to ask him to clarify?
Yeah, every day almost questions come up in my mind that I would like to discuss with him and get his opinion about. The sad thing was that in the 10 years that was left of his life, after he worked in Tunis with the PLO on the plan for the economy of a future Palestinian state, his health was very bad. He was having heart problems all the time, and he was upset and depressed because of the political situation. And I just couldn't press him to go back and listen to the memoirs and comment on them and edit them himself.
Yes.
And then I could have asked those questions.
But
we never had that opportunity.
But it's wonderful that you got what you did get. What I was struck with initially, the first chapters, was his early life. And as you know, Palestine and Lebanon and Syria and Jordan, even though at the time that he was born and was growing up, the borders had been sort of developed by the Western powers, you still had this sense of somehow the area being open because they moved from Syria into Lebanon, into Palestine, and while they may have had to go through various border crossings, it was with ease and also with comfort, as though it were the same country. And I think people don't realize how much those borders have actually cut off the natural economic and social flow of the area. And did he ever comment more fully on that aspect?
No, I think it comes through in his descriptions. For instance, Al-Bassa, the village that he describes in the second chapter, was actually once part of Lebanon. Yeah. And one feels that in the character, that it had as a rather fun-loving village.
Yes.
And people came from Lebanon to teach there in the schools or to be doctors there. So you feel all the time he doesn't comment on it, but it's there, in his memories. And I think it's a very important part of the book that the family moved, between Syria, Palestine, and then Lebanon.
Yes, and what was important too were some of the social activities, some of the clothing, some of the way they did their houses. And I found your touch in that part of the book. You must have been asking him those kinds of questions, and it's one of very few recorded histories we have of, in addition to your work, of the way life was. So we thank you in advance, and I would like to go on to some of the more political parts of the book, but first ask you, what do you think were the most important parts of his life in his memoir?
Well, I think the stretch of his memories, going right back really to the pre-Druze uprising period in Syria and, the beginning of the uprising against the French, and coming right forward up to the resistance movement, the PLO, and his work in Tunis, the sheer historical stretch is kind of valuable in one life. And then the people that he knew, that he met during his life in politics, although he was never an important politician, but he met people like the Mufti and all the Palestinian leaders, people like Ismahan, for instance, this description of Ismahan.
Yes, I was fascinated with Ismahan.
Nice bits of the book, yeah. And of course Lebanese politicians. And so, and then what I like also about the memoirs is he gives a feel of what life was like, and the life of the family.
Yeah.
How they put everything into education, for instance.
Yeah. I mean, he was an amazing man because he was consistent and principled. and he was committed to Palestine from the very beginning. He didn't turn his back on the Palestinian dilemma. He joined, like so many in those days, the PPS, the Syrian Nationalist Party, Syrian Socialist Nationalist Party as it came to be called, but popularly known as PPS. And he knew Antoine Saadeh, and he admired him initially, as so many did. And I always wondered, people like Hisham Sharabi were in that. Fayez, of course, became a part of it. And what you get when you read about the PPS in this country is that, it was a terrible thing that happened, blah, blah, blah. But in fact, it was probably the only really secular party that really was concerned with Palestine and reintegrating the area that the Western powers had been splitting up. And so Antoine Saadeh was highly respected initially, and it was obvious in Yusif's life that he was doing it, but he became disenchanted as Saadeh began to develop characteristics that were requiring people to salute him and almost fascist. So did he say anything more to you about his period with the PPS? Did you get a sense and feeling other than what is in the book about that period?
I think it was a topic we discussed from the early days of our marriage, and I always had the feeling that what had appealed to him about the PPS was, first of all, discipline. And he felt the Arabs needed that, a structure, political structure. And then, of course, as you mentioned, secularism. It was anti-sectarian.
Yes.
That was very important. I mean, there were many members from all the minority sects. He joined it in AUB, and actually I think Fayez was a more important member of the PPS than Yusif was. They joined it almost at the same time, and Fayez rose very rapidly to be the cultural minister or something. He had an important post in the party. And his conflict with Saadi also was one of the factors that disillusioned Yusif. And he didn't withdraw because he felt that would be, he told me, tribalistic if he cut his ties with the PPS just because of what happened between Saadi and Fayez. He stayed, but he diminished his activities more and more, so that by the time we married, he practically wasn't doing anything with them anymore. But he never actually stopped being a member formally.
Mm-hmm. Well, I found that, as I say, very interesting because, again, Antoine Saadeh in this country has a negative name. In any case, I found what he had to say about the high intelligence of Saadeh very interesting. And you're right, it was the discipline, because Yusif and Fayez always had this notion that things should be organized. But then he got out of hand, and I remember when he was executed in Lebanon, and that it was Sulh who had ordered this. Sulh having himself been an Arab nationalist before he became prime minister, although he said he never left that orientation. And PPS was seen as almost a threat in Lebanon, almost a kind of, that felt they might be a coup because it was so popular. In any case, Yusif also became very active in trying to work with the Arab Higher Committee. And he also expressed admiration for the Mufti, again, who has a very negative name in American press. But the Mufti was a highly intelligent person, if not always the great on planning. And there's a sentence in the book where Yusif, basically expresses thanks to the Mufti for after Yusif had been a prisoner of war, where he gave him a kind of veterans little sum to get started again. And he talked about how kind and generous he is, at the same time what a devil he could be. Can you elaborate on that sentence for us?
I don't think I can add very much. I know that Yusif went on visiting the Mufti, as many Palestinians did, in Lebanon during, in the early 50s. Mm-hmm. As you know, he lived here then, up somewhere in the mountains, I think. And Yusif used to go with Khalil Tabari from Tiberias, who was a close friend, to visit the Mufti. And so also I think that he felt that his leadership had not been ideal leadership, not been strong leadership. He relied very much on his kind of cronies, or his and of course on religion, but that he wasn't capable of forming a really disciplined political party.
Yes.
But he still, admired him and respected him, and went on visiting him.
Well, it is very interesting, because everybody sort of brings up his relationship or his visiting of Hitler. And as Yusif pointed out, whatever he did, he did in terms of trying to alleviate the situation in Palestine. And I thought that was a very important sentence in the book about him. I want to go on now. There's so much in the book. There was Yusif trying to collect tax money before the Nakba, and his work with the Arab High Committee, so forth. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the highlights of his work with the PLO. He was one of the first members of the Palestine National Council, and then later he became part of the executive committee. And his accent was always on planning, that you can't do something without planning. You have to look at, is this worth doing? Will you get gains towards your goal? And yet, as much as he worked very hard on presenting plans to the PLO, not only in this early stage. The PLO was formed in 1964 and supported by the Arab League at the time. And in essence, it was often thought that it was Nasser who pushed it ahead because he was getting so many complaints that nothing was being done about the Palestinians. But after he did this planning, and it was not really looked at or accepted, and he began to realize there was infighting and corruption and so forth, he went on nonetheless to accept the role of trying to plan for a Palestinian state economy under Arafat's reign over the PLO. He obviously was such a patriot that even though he was disappointed in the first efforts, he went on to do this. Can you tell us, did he really have any hopes that that in planning for a possible state economy for Palestinians, that it would be any different than his previous experiences with the PLO?
He was 100% optimist, and after every disappointment, hope sprung up again. He also had a very good relationship with Abu Ala, Ahmed Kuray,
yes,
who was actually the one who brought him to Tunis to work on the plan. He had no idea that there was a possibility in the near future of there being a Palestinian state. He was totally not involved in the Oslo negotiations, and that news came as a tremendous shock to him when he was just finishing up the plan. For him, the plan was for the future.
Yes.
He believed very much that state planning was necessary for a healthy economy. I don't know if he would still believe that today, but that was his position then. The chance for him to make that plan and to involve lots of Palestinians inside and outside Palestine in working on it was a tremendous opportunity and challenge for him. He's never had a job that he put so much into. I mean, he used to work every day up until 10 at night. He got really, really tired, and that's why I think, the shock of what happened when the Oslo negotiations took place and the negotiators came back, and he discovered that they had not taken map makers, they had not taken lawyers, they had come away with a really bad deal, and he had worked for that. He never recovered from it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it was amazing to me how much of his personal life he gave up to plan and to take things seriously and to hope that there would be at some point a future Palestinian state and that it would have a plan for development. And yet at the same time he knew there were so many factions within the PLO, so many different points of view. He understood the corruption. He understood Arafat was not a leader that consulted with anyone. And yet he pursued in hopes that this would happen. What comments did he have to say when he finally left Tunisia? Oslo had occurred. He was terribly disappointed in it. We were all upset, although early on many people had supported Oslo. People like Edward Said and Nasir Aruri and Samir Farsoon, myself, immediately saw its terrible fault lines and what it was going to lead to. What did Yusif have to say when he came home about the people in Tunis, especially Arafat?
Yeah, I mean, he talked a lot, particularly to journalists in Beirut, about his attempts to set up, not just him, with Tony Zahlan and Khalil Hindi, to set up a kind of economic administration that would not allow Arafat to control all the external funds that were going to come in from the World Bank. And Arafat just, counteracted every move. And Yusif went on arguing to the end. I don't know why he believed that he could convince anybody. He knew the Abawat, he knew where their loyalties and their interests lay. And yet, he went on trying to convince them to counteract Arafat's, desire to monopolize everything. And I don't understand myself, how he was able to continue fighting this battle while, as you said, understanding the personalities involved, the conflicts of interest involved, which really allowed Arafat to do what he wanted. He just had this great faith in reason and in argument and in his own power to convince people. And I think it was the kind of discovery of the defeat that made him so depressed in the last 10 years of his life. He didn't really live again properly after coming away from Tunis.
Well,
it was very sad.
Yeah, it was indeed very sad, and yet he met some people that he admired and respected, but the majority were, in one way or another, got caught up in this power drive. He never really wanted to be in any major office of the PLO. He'd rather do the work and not be an officer. And yet he had natural leadership ability. So I found that not only very interesting, but so typical of Yusif. I'm going to just step back for a minute and have you talk about a very painful period when he was a prisoner of war. I know that you had not yet married, had not yet perhaps even met, but he spent that year, and he sort of rose to the occasion as a leader. And I was fascinated with the way in which he wrote daily comments on pieces of cloth and sewed them into his clothing. And did he ever? I never knew he was a prisoner of war, and I've known Yusif. I mean, I met Yusif years ago, and he never spoke of himself. Fayez didn't either, but Yusif always was very. Whenever I would see him at a conference, he was always very cheery and yet dead serious about what he was talking about. And I'm not sure anybody ever knew his experience as a prisoner of war. Do you want to comment a little bit about that period, as much as you can? I mean, it's very hard to talk about someone's life, especially when you didn't know him at that time.
Well, in fact, that was the first story that Yusif ever told me when we were going out, long before we got engaged and married. And so it was a very important story for me. And we actually began the recording process with that chapter. Of course, afterwards, I rearranged things chronologically. But that was the first chapter we recorded. And that story is always, very moving to me when I read it again. And Yusif says, I think, that he didn't realize that he had the capacity to be a leader until this thing actually happened, that they were taken prisoner. And he realized that it would be very easy for the Zionists or the Israelis at that point to just get rid of them, No one would have known. And he confronted, as he tells, the various attempts, to shoot, for instance, prisoners whom they knew had been in the resistance, by pretending they tried to escape and then shooting them in the back. And he had this amazing courage. And I think this is very striking because his physical, actually, he wasn't very strong. I mean, apart from his heart problems and his ulcers and his discs, he actually physically wasn't very strong. And particularly when he was a kid, he felt, that he was a weakling, and he did exercises and swimming in order to try and strengthen himself. And I think that's one of the things he admired about Antoun Saadi, who's physically a very strong man, a great swimmer and a great mountain climber. So what I think was admirable about Yusif is that for a kind of slightly weedy person, excuse me, a not very strong physical person, he had great moral courage, and he was ready to challenge anybody.
He did indeed, and I remember him as being so very thin and frail, and yet every time I would see him, here in this area, he seemed to tower over people with a motivation and a strength that overcame this sort of thin, frail-looking man. But he was strong. He was really a very strong person. He never complained, and I always found him to be amazing. And people here loved him dearly. They loved him dearly, and had a great deal of respect for him, as they did for Fayez. I mean, Fayez was very loved here, but he died very young. In any case, and then of course Anis was also loved, but people knew less of him. He was with the Palestine Research Organization, and that was bombed, as I recall, in one of the wars, and a lot of the papers.
Yeah, indeed. Anis lost part of an eye and an ear and one or two fingers.
And fingers, I remember that, yeah. Well, I wonder if you have anything more you would like to share with us that's in the book, and to encourage people to read this, because Yusif's life really spanned the end of the Ottoman Empire, the Mandate, the Nakba, even the Suez War, the '67 war, the First Intifada, the Second Intifada, Oslo. I mean, he is the history of Palestine since the beginning of the Zionist movement to take over Palestine. And I really wonder who he would look at today and say, these are clean, principled leaders for the future. Do we see any on the horizon?
I think it's always been said about the Palestinian people, Elaine, that they have never had the leadership that they deserved.
That's correct.
For me, one of the importances of Yusif's life is that he represents, I think, a large class of Palestinians who struggle without, a really worthy leadership. And there are many others like him. I mean, maybe certain characteristics I admire, for instance, are unique, but I don't think he's alone in being part of a much larger corpus of Palestinians who still struggle one way or another, either by joining demonstrations or doing intellectual work, or there are so many ways and in so many areas. So I think that we can gain hope from reading his life that there will always be Palestinians like him, however bad the political situation is and however abject the leadership seems to be at the current moment.
I think this is why his book is so important, not only for the history that's in it, and you've done a wonderful job about arranging his tapes, and the last chapter on his Bread and Dignity, I think really presents for young people, young leaders, and inspiration. And I plan to share this book with a number of young Palestinian leaders that I think will be the future of Palestine. But let us close this interview, at least on Yusif's book, and then I'd like to talk a little bit about you and what you're doing these days. On Bread with Dignity, the book that he wrote, and which is your discussion in the last chapter. And you talk about the fact that it was dominated by the idea of social justice and what were Arab nationalist needs. Tell us a little bit about that book and how really characteristic it is of Yusif, and what did he, and what specific ways did he talk about social justice? What was needed economically and socially and politically?
Yeah, he wrote the book on a voyage from America to Beirut that lasted, I think, 3 weeks. He worked every day on it, and then he would sunbathe and swim on the boat. And I think that the book, although it's never been translated into English, has been very influential, particularly because it combines the idea of material satisfaction, the need for material satisfaction, i.e. bread, khubaz, and the need for dignity, karama. Those two needs have to be combined for him. And I think this is, a very important insight for economic planning in the Arab world, still up to date. And one of the things I was really happy about when I was writing that last chapter, because we never really recorded on his career as an economist, it just didn't get done. I was happy because I found there were many young Palestinian economists who were rediscovering Yusif and going beyond him in many ways. And there are new books coming out, critical books. And I feel he would be happy about that too, that he's not alone anymore. When he wrote Bread and Dignity, I don't think there were more than a handful of Arab economists, and maybe not other Palestinian economists, thinking seriously about political economy, what that means, and how you have to confront, external influence. I'm afraid I forgot that when I was talking about why he joined the PPS, and at the beginning was the other main reason was that it confronted foreign intervention and domination, and that was always important for him. And it comes up again in his economic thinking.
Yes, very, very important, actually. Do you want to complete our discussion of Yusif's life with any final comments before I ask you a little bit about what you're up to these days.
I sometimes regret, actually, that I directed the memoirs by asking him questions, therefore obliging him in a way to talk about things that, if he'd been completely free, he might not have talked about. And so it's always bothered me that I pushed his recollections in a certain direction, particularly social history, because this is what I'm interested in. But then, of course, I think without me, he wouldn't have ever recorded his life story
I think
at all.
I know that's true. I know that's true. We're very grateful to you.
It's been a great interest and fascination for me.
Mm-hmm.
Important part of my life.
Yeah, yes.
Getting it out.
Well, you've done wonderful things. Rosemary, let me turn a little bit to you. I know you're a very modest person and you don't like talking about yourself, but you are considered the premier anthropologist, the premier human being on issues related to the Palestinian refugees and beyond. I mean, your contributions to the field of anthropology alone are amazing. Tell us what you are. You already have a major body of work, but what are you working on these days? What is captivating you at the moment? And I know it's always something very human.
Well, I got interested about 2 years ago in the question of why, 68 years after the Nakba, there isn't a good book in Arabic for Palestinian children, particularly children in camps, on Palestinian history. Or anywhere, actually, in the Arab world. And I started asking people why they think this to be the case. And then I started asking people, supposing there were to be a book, what would you want to see in it? So now what I'm working on is getting people's views on this and expanding the network, and eventually hoping to put it on an interactive net website so that ordinary Palestinians can contribute to the writing of Palestinian history instead of it being done just by specialists, and historians, very often under the political direction of, well, we know what happened in occupied Palestine, to their textbooks. Obviously, we don't want other books like that. So this is what I'm working on now.
It's amazing. And in the background in Beirut, I could hear the call to prayer. And actually, it was quite lovely. I recall being in Beirut, and it's always a very, very wonderful and peaceful moment when I would hear the call to prayer. Your work continues to be important. I hope that we will know when you're going to publish this. We thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and writing this book on Yusif Sayigh, a most amazing man from a most amazing woman. Thank you very much, Rosemary. Thank you, and we hope to talk to you again.
Thank you, Elaine, and many thanks to our guest, Dr. Rosemary Sayigh. Stay tuned, there's more to come after this short program ID.
You are watching The Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
Thank you so much for joining us at the Arabic Hour today. On behalf of all of the volunteers here at the Arabic Hour, this is Ghinwa Hakim, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
The Arabic Hour has been brought to you in part by the William G. Abdullah Memorial Library, a resource center for information and education on the Arab American experience, the American Arabic Benevolent Association, an umbrella organization for community endeavors, the Nicholas G. Barham Veterans Association and Ladies Auxiliary, providing veteran services scholarships with community pride, and by our members as well as contributions by viewers like you.